That's now live.
Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to begin by welcoming those members of the public and press who are watching the live stream of this meeting via the Council's website. Members, you are by now aware of the need to keep your video camera switched on for the duration of the meeting and to keep your microphones muted unless I invite you to speak. Also, please use the raised hand function at the bottom of the screen if you would like to speak, and I will then introduce you into the conversation. There is always a risk that we may run into technical problems, and I'd ask for your patience if we do. Should this occur, I'll declare an adjournment for a short while whilst the fault is addressed, and the public broadcast will be suspended. If this is not possible to address the problem, the meeting may be abandoned and reconvened at a later date. Please note that the revised version of item 7, the business planning proposals for 2021 to 2026 opening update and review, was published on Friday the 2nd of October and circulated to all members of the committee. There were no changes made to the service specific areas of the report, but the corporate narrative was updated to provide clearer context on the extent of the financial challenges which this council faces. An additional urgent item was also added to the agenda after publication with my consent as chairman and in accordance with the arrangements for urgent decisions by committees set out in the Constitution. We will take this item at the end of the published agenda. Finally, I would remind members and officers that all virtual meetings are recorded and these recordings will be published on the Council's website. Okay, so we'll move to agenda item number 1, which is apologies for absence. I will begin by calling members' names out of the committee to establish you are present. We have received apologies from Councillor Hay, who is substituted by Councillor Costello. Okay, so Councillor Ambrose Smith.
Present.
Councillor Costello.
Present.
Councillor Downs.
Present.
Councillor Every.
Present.
Councillor Hoy.
Present.
Councillor Netsinger.
Present.
Councillor Simon Taylor.
Present.
Councillor Whitehead.
Present.
Councillor Wisson.
Present.
And then we have our 2 co-opted members, Andrew Reid representing the Church of England Diocese of Ely.
Present.
And Flavio Vitesse representing the Roman Catholic Diocese of East Anglia.
Present.
Did we hear him? Did someone hear?
Yeah.
Flavio? Yeah, okay, thank you. Nice to see you all, and myself, Councillor Bywater. Okay, does any member wish to declare a disclosable pecuniary interest or non-statutory disclosable interest? I'm sure by now you know the process. If something does come up and you want to, just raise your hand. David Ambrose Smith.
Yes, Chair, thank you. Agenda item number 6 at 5.5, page 25, acquisition of playing field. It's at Littleport, and I'm a Lecker School Governor and also chair of the charity for Littleport Leisure. I will stay in the meeting but abstain from voting.
Okay, thank you very much. Any other hands? No, I can't see any. So we'll move on then. Thank you. We're being asked to approve the minutes of the meeting on the 15th of September 2020 as a correct record. Can I ask if any member who does not agree with this proposal to click the raised hand function on the right of the screen now? Okay, I can't see anybody. So on that basis, I'll assume that members are happy to approve the minutes of the meeting on the September, and I'll sign them as a hard copy when I get back into the office eventually. Okay. Move on to item 4. An updated action log was included in the published papers for this meeting. Since then, further updates have been circulated in relation to the percentage of children receiving free school meals and the Duke of Edinburgh award scheme. If any members have any questions on the action log, would they use the raise hand function on the right of the screen now to see if anybody wants to raise any issues in relation to the action logs? Councillor Simon Taylor.
Yeah, thank you very much for sending through the information on the Duke of Edinburgh. The only thing that I found was missing was I just wanted to know a bit more about the outside bodies. you know, where would I contact them? Where would the public contact them? That's the only bit that I found missing.
Okay, and that's in respect of the Duke of Edinburgh Award, did you say?
Yes, correct. Yeah, we got the information through, talking about the different awards and what was available in the outside centres, but just wanted to know a little bit about where we would go for information with regards to the outside bodies who are now doing it.
John, can I ask you to come in there, please?
Yeah, I'll happily go away and clarify that for you. I think the delivery of most of the Duke of Edinburgh is now Schools Direct, but I'm sure we can find you a list of providers that support Cambridgeshire, so you can see that full entire list. Is that what you're after? Just somebody that delivers the wider offer? Okay.
Thank you.
I'm pretty sure it's on their website, but we'll get it for you. But
okay, thank you.
Schools and a range of independent sectors, organisations do deliver it, but I'll check for you.
Okay, thanks, John. Okay, so Lucy Netzinger.
Thank you. I've got two quick questions. The first was on the school cycle paths. It says somebody had asked about lighting of school cycle paths, which I think is really important this year. And it says there'll be an update from the other service director, and I just wondered if we'd had that update. Sorry if
I can come in. I'll answer that one, Lucy. There was an email sent round on the 1st of October to everybody.
Okay, thank you.
I'll ensure that Rashenda, can you just recirculate that to Councillor Netzinger, please? Just so
that's really helpful.
You may have missed it, Lucy.
That's great. And the second one was on SEND recovery, where it says that will be reported in the November service directory report. I don't think we've got a meeting in November, so can I just ask for reassurance that we will have that on the agenda for the meeting in December, even if the service director report comes in November?
There is a planned meeting in November. John, do you want to just chip in there?
Yeah, I'm happy to provide a note outside of the meeting, or equally whenever we can next come to committee, we can provide an update. So
I think it would just be good to have it discussed in committee. So as long as it's coming to committee, that's fine.
Absolutely, it will. Before we make anything about any other announcements, it will come through committee for consideration.
That's great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Any other questions? No, so I'll take that as noted. Thank you very much, members. We'll move on to item 5, which we haven't received any public questions or petitions, so we'll move on to agenda item number 6. Okay, so we obviously turn now to item 6, the Service Committee review of the draft 2021 capital programme. This report contains an appendix which is exempt from publication under paragraph 3 of part 1 of the Schedule 12A of the Local Government Act 1972, as amended, in that it would not be in the public interest for this information to be disclosed. Information relating to the financial or business affairs of any particular person, including the authority holding that information. If any member wants to discuss the exemption information contained in this appendix, we will need to consider excluding the press and the public from the debate. I know members did get forewarning of this and there wasn't any questions, but does any member wish to discuss the exempt appendix? No, so I'll just remind you to err on caution that if you do refer to that, it is a confidential item, and I'll pick up on it if you do. But in that case, then we'll crack on with it. Ian Trafford, the Interim Education Capital Strategy Manager, would you introduce the report? Martin Wade, Strategic Finance Business Partner, is also available to answer any questions. And I think Kerry Newson is here as well. Is that right, Rashenda? Yeah. Okay, so Ian, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Yeah, in introducing the report, the first part of the report are the standard paragraphs that go to all service committees and explains the overall context and process by which services undertake the annual review of the capital programme, and in particular identifying new schemes for inclusion. Therefore, what's before us today is the first iteration of the new programme, which will be considered again by this committee once General Purposes Committee has considered the overall capital strategy at its meeting in November. The new schemes identified for inclusion in the programme are almost all basic need proposals bar 2, providing the additional places required for the County Council to meet its statutory sufficiency duty. And these are set out in the table in paragraph 5.5 of the report. There are quite a number of new schemes this year, and that does, I think, reflect the activity being seen on a number of major housing development sites, where they're at pre-application stage, outline application, or active sites currently being built out. That may be the effect of some post-COVID catch-up, post-lockdown, or it may reflect, but it's probably too early to tell, house builders' view of the current and future housing market in Cambridgeshire. The other part of the review of the programme is to look at existing schemes, and there are some reprofiled schemes where costs have changed, and they're set out in paragraph 5.7 of the report with a brief explanation of those changes. So there are some schemes with reduced costs and scope, and some with increased costs, and as I say, a brief explanation provided. Before getting into detail, I just thought I'd cover some of the issues that will impact on the programme over time. And one of those is COVID. There are schemes that were on site or where contracts had been let in the current year when COVID restrictions were put in place. So we have got valid contractor claims for increased costs on some of these schemes, because obviously that has had an impact. At the moment, those are currently going through a process of being settled, and once we have settled costs for those schemes, they will have to be included in the final scheme costs that will be reported. In future, the council's seeking to protect itself against future claims by now asking for tender prices on the basis of the current restrictions that are in place and that govern the construction industry. So while it's difficult to predict the future, we are trying to, when future schemes get to tender stage or site, mitigate future impacts upon the council. A large source of our funding for basic needs comes from government through the annual SCAP process. I think it's probably right to point out that officers are forecasting reduced levels of allocations in future years simply because of the way the funding for new places is calculated. Most of our programme, as I've just said, with the new schemes is based around new housing and housing growth. And the assumption within the SCAP process, the annual SCAP process, is that those will by and large be developer funded. So you don't draw down basic need funding for those. SCAP tended to fund those places where population was growing in existing communities, not related to housing. And there's evidence emerging in Cambridgeshire that the birth rate has peaked and even declining slightly. So in future returns, SCAP returns, our forecast will reflect that slight tailing off. So we do anticipate lower allocations of basic need in the future. Other changes, as I've hinted, are linked to possibly the housing market, as an increasing part of our programme is linked to new development sites and housing growth. The potential not for those schemes to come forward or the school places not need to be required, but we are probably subject to greater risk of timing changes because provision will be more closely linked to speed and pace of development. And still a remaining risk that we reported on last year was the move from Section 106 to CIL, or Community Infrastructure Levy contributions from developers in the funding of infrastructure, in particular school provision. I think that risk still remains, but it's probably been delayed by COVID, as the introduction of SIL is directly linked to the preparation of new district council local plans. And it's probably fair to say the timescales for their adoption have become extended during this COVID period. So a number are taking longer to come to fruition. There's also the current national consultation on the planning white paper, and it remains to be seen while that's out for consultation what the districts will do in terms of their own plan making. Will they delay it a little bit further to await the outcome, or will they press ahead? So it remains a risk, but it's one that's probably yet to materialise in full. So the recommendation before members is to note the overall context for the preparation of the capital programme, but also comment on the draft proposals contained in the paper and endorse them for further development.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ian. We'll now go to members. Councillor Whitehead.
Thank you, Chair. I've got 2 points I want to raise. First of all, to follow up what has just been said about SIL and 106 money. I mean, obviously, we've had problems with that in the past in Huntingdon when there was an issue about a primary school. I understood, and maybe I'm wrong, Ian, I understood that it was up to a council to decide whether to go for 106 agreement or whether to go for SIL. Are you saying that in fact it will all become SIL and there will be no option for the county council itself to develop 106 proposals with developers? That's the first question, and I've got another one.
Okay, so do you want to take that one, Ian, and then Joan, we'll come back to you.
Certainly. Yes, it is a matter for district councils as to whether they proceed with a SIL scheme across the district or retain the current 106 process. I can't recall what the deadline is for how long they can carry on with existing arrangements before they're required to have SIL in place, or even if there is a deadline. I think what's more important is districts have got some freedom as to how they construct their SIL process. So while there's the scope for having SIL apply across all housing developments, in practice, a lot of districts do have a sort of threshold. So they'll say up to medium-sized developments, say 200, 250 is SIL. But then the larger developments, where you're more likely to require on-site infrastructure like primary schools, etc., can remain 106. So I think in discussion with the districts, probably it's more advantageous to the county council to try and influence the adoption of SIL, so that on those larger developments where we know we need on-site provision, we can still retain the direct link between contributions through a 106 process and funding the new school provision. So that's probably a bit of an either or answer. Yes, SIL is a risk. The districts do control the introduction of the scheme and how it's applied. It is their decision, but I suppose we can seek to influence that in the most positive way for us. And as I said, probably the compromise, and one which I think did exist for a while in Hunts, I'm not sure if it still does, was to have that cut-off point where above a certain level it was still 106 that applied to housing developments.
Thank you. Of course, we did have the problem with Huntingdon where there was a new primary school needed and they were refusing to fund it out of their SIL money. I think it was resolved in the end after a very long and protracted series of negotiations, but it did leave the council in a very awkward position. Either we had to pay for the primary school or we had to bus children, and that was obviously unsatisfactory for everybody, particularly parents who wouldn't be at all happy about there being no school on a major housing development. But thank you for that clarification, Ian. My second question is page 25, the bottom item of box 5.5, and this is a matter very dear to my heart. It talks about land being acquired north of Cherry Hinton for a new secondary school, I believe. Obviously, there's been talk of a new secondary school to serve Abbey Ward, which is my ward now, ever since I became elected in 2013. And I just wondered where this land was, because there's been extensive searches for land, and we've never managed to find any. So I'm interested to know which bit of land it is you are about to acquire north of Cherry Hinton.
Okay. I believe it's on the linked to the development site, which I think is the part of the Marshall site that can be developed before they relocate.
Okay.
So it's that, yeah, I'm trying to get my geography right. Is that the southern end of the Marshall site? And the developer, he's giving us sort of 2/3 of the site through the 106 agreement, related to the pupil generation and need arising from the development. But we're having to pay for that part of the site which meets an existing need. There's about 2 forms of entry, or 300 children due to attend the school that aren't linked to the development site. So that additional allocation you see reported there is for us to get extra site area and ensure that it meets both the local need and the need arising from the new housing. Normally we try and get obviously new school sites in new developments transferred free of charge under the 106, but a slightly different situation applies here, as the site also, or the school will also meet an existing need as well. So we've had to find a sum of money to fund that part of the site to which it relates.
Right, and is that existing need related solely to the development around Cherry Hinton, or is it also linked to the development? I mean, Abbey Ward itself, I think, still needs some places. And of course, there is the wing development, which is coming on stream. So is there going to be a need for a second secondary school to serve Abbey Ward and the wing development? Or will this school serve both that and the development around Cherry Hinton?
No, the long-term planning, if the Marshall site is fully developed, and as you say, wing as well, the long-term planning sees the need for a further secondary school to serve all of the planned development in the area, and of course the usual caveat if all of that comes forward.
Yeah. Right. So we still haven't found a site then for Abbey Ward, but are we assuming that there will be further opportunities on Marshall's site? I mean, the site that's nearest to Wing and the Newmarket Road, as opposed to Cherry Hinton. That there may be land there available for a secondary school to serve Wing and the Abbey Ward. Yes,
those are the opportunities we'd look at in discussion with Marshalls as the developer through a 106 agreement.
Thank you, Simon.
Okay, thank you, Joan. Councillor Netzinger.
Thank you. So my question relates to the Cambourne West Secondary School, which is referred to on page 27, where you talk about the there's actually a school that isn't needed on this occasion, which, given that there is already a school in Cambourne, it is actually quite good news that that school is going to be able to meet the need there. So my question really is, I think it's 10.2 million that we're not going to have to pay for that new school. That money, is that all county council money, or will a substantial chunk of it not come to us because we're not going to need it and it stays with the developer?
Okay, I'm sure Kerry will correct me if I'm wrong, but actually we're still expanding the existing Cambourne Village College by 4 forms of entry, and that is the level of need we anticipate coming from the Cambourne West development, 2,500 homes still to be built out. So we will still be arguing that the developer needs to pay for those 4 forms of entry. So that 10 million will be a saving to the council and not to the developer, because there's a clear, strong link between the new development and the need to provide 4 forms of entry. And that's what we'll be continuing to argue for.
So it's just about the money being moved from one pot, effectively, or kind of one site to another?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, but okay. So the council will still end up with a large. I don't quite understand how we get the saving, if that makes sense. Is that because the cost would have been, we were expecting to have to make that expansion in the first place, or is it a land cost?
Ian, do you want me to answer?
Yes, if you don't mind, Kerry.
So our Section 106 never really fully covers the cost of the developments that we need to undertake. So effectively, the Camborne West, when we had it in as a separate project, was funded partially by the Section 106 that we were anticipating through that development, and the borrowing in addition to that to fund that entire scheme. By bringing the scheme back into the sort of the existing campus that we've already got there, we actually make a saving. And like Ian said, we will be going to continue to seek the Section 106 to cover what we need, but actually the saving that we're likely to make is the fact that we will not need to borrow. In addition, we're hoping that the actual developer contributions will cover all of what we need to do on an existing site, because obviously the cost of an additional site would entail a lot more infrastructure needing to be there around services, etc.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Kerry. That totally answers the question.
Thanks, Kerry. We've got Councillor Simon Taylor, and I can also see Councillor Downs. You click yes, so I'm assuming you want to come in as well. So if we take Councillor Simon Taylor first, then we'll come to Councillor Downs.
Thank you. So I'm just trying to find my paperwork. Be with you in a minute. Right. Okay. Ian, I think you did mention about, but I'm a bit confused now. It's 5.8, so we are looking at the future schemes. They're saying contractors are expected to factor in the current government guidelines within their tenders and adhere to these. So is it that the council are not putting the specific, sorry, I can never say that word, COVID clauses are not being included within our contracts, as to the aim to encourage the contractor to submit the competitive price, or working within the current social distancing? I thought you said actually contrary to that. I thought you said different to that. So I'm a bit confused. I thought you said that we were factoring this into our contracts. But if we're not, does this not open us up? Does this not sort of lead us a little bit open?
Okay, sorry for what I might have said. Your interpretation is correct. We're not putting specific COVID clauses in our contract, and that's after sort of receiving lengthy legal and procurement advice. The advice we had was we're more likely to encourage competition between contractors and get the best price if they tender against one another on the basis of the current restrictions. Whereas if you sort of have a tender process, award the contract, and then start negotiation with the successful contractor of specific COVID clauses, there's a suspicion then you're encouraging the contractor to identify extra costs, and then you're into a process of negotiation about those extra costs. So, I mean, there have been different approaches to doing it, but for those reasons, we went with the former approach. Now, within the contract, there's still contractors will still have the ability to claim for what's called a relevant event, and that's something that couldn't reasonably have been predicted or foreseen. So that's why we think if current restrictions stay the same or are eased for the industry, then we're not exposed to a risk of any further claims. I suppose it only becomes an issue if the current restrictions get more severe. But even then, we're not starting from a position of no restrictions like we were in February, March, and moving to a lockdown situation. So we hope we've protected ourselves as best as we can while still getting those competitive prices in. But I suppose a small risk does remain, but perhaps not as significant as what we've had to deal with in the past 6 to 9 months.
Okay. Thank you for that. Yeah, no, I understand that more. It's just my worry is, I mean, a lot of employers are now putting different clauses into their contracts now for their employees. Because of the situation of COVID, because they're obviously having to safeguard themselves to not having to pay employees money if this case of COVID expands or anything else comes to light similar. So yeah, there is a risk. I understand that you're trying to mitigate that. Yeah, thank you, Ian.
Okay, thank you, Simon. Councillor Peter Downs.
Yes, thank you. My question is related to page 23, paragraph 5.1, and it is partially to do with capital programme and also partially to do with future budget proposals on the same theme. The reason I was on the last minute joining the meeting was that I was being harangued by an anxious grandparent about the closure of early education settings. Actually, he was ringing about his grandchildren in Cambridge. And I just want to know what our policy is in relation to the provision, the adequate provision and maintenance of early education.
John Lewis, do you want to come in there, please?
Yeah. Obviously, Peter, it would very much depend on which type of early years provision you're describing, but on the whole, our duty around early years relates to sufficiency, not the buildings or the maintenance of those buildings. We do sometimes lease those assets out to organisations to deliver. Sometimes they are repairing leases. At other times they are fully transferred, depending on the scenario and the setting. But our role and responsibility is to maintain provision in a local area, not necessarily support individual settings. So I think we have provided a paper now on the situation around that sufficiency discussion. I did go out with the previous update, but happy, Peter, if there's a particular issue around a Cambridge provision, to have that conversation.
Yes, I think I will contact you offline, if I may, Jonathan, and you can explain it to me so I can pass it on. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I can't see any other questions from members, so in that case, then we'll go to the recommendations. Ian did touch on them. Peter, you've just raised a no. I take it you're just by error. That is it. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so we'll go to the recommendations. They are on your papers in front of you. I'm assuming that everybody's in agreement with this. If you're not happy with the recommendations, if you raise your right hand function. Okay, I've not seen anybody who's indicated that, so I'll take that as a unanimously approved recommendations. And so thank you very much, Ian and Kerry and Martin, for preparing that paper. So we'll move on now to agenda item number 7, the Service Committee review of the draft revenue business planning proposals for 21-22 to 25-26 and the opening update and review. I'd remind members of the committee and those watching the meeting that a revised report was published on Friday the 2nd of October, and it is this report that we'll be working from today. So can I assume that everybody's taken sight of that? If you've got an issue that you haven't seen it, then let me know. Okay, so that's good. Lou Williams, the Service Director for Children's Safeguarding, and John Lewis, the Service Director for Education, will introduce the report. And Martin Wade, the Strategic Finance Business Partner, is also available to answer any questions. So Lou, shall we start with you and then move to John once you've finished?
Yeah, happy to do that. So, so very briefly, I mean, this follows on from discussions we had at the last committee meeting, really, where what I was saying was that in terms of children's social care services, we're still in a period where we don't really know what the full impact of COVID and any economic fallout will be in terms of demand for children's services. The report indicates where we think there may be an increase in demand. We have identified some funds that so a bid has been made for MCHLG funding in terms of further supporting early help and children's social care services to meet that demand. What I can say at the moment, and will say again in relation to my service director report a bit later, is that we're not seeing a very significant spike at the moment. So we think that, you know, our projections are right, that actually what we will see is a slower burn in terms of increasing demand, and that will go across this financial year and the next. As I say, you can see there under paragraph 4.4 some of the areas where we expect there to be some additional pressures. This is very much a work in progress. We do think that we're able to make some further savings in relations to children in care costs, and in terms of the likely business cases, that will be the bulk of where the savings we believe can be achieved. But obviously it is a bit unknown at the moment, in the sense that we're not entirely clear what the impact of COVID will be.
Okay, thanks, Luke. John, over to you.
Thanks, Chair. I think I send a similar message to Lou. We're still working out what our service pressures look like. 4.5 of the report lays out our key strategic areas of concern. So particularly focusing around vulnerable children is going to be very, very significant. And, you know, we've talked previously about electively home educated behaviour. Other challenges moving forward are going to be key. So I think our budget proposals may shift somewhat over time. In terms of the revenue pressures that are coming forward, you'll be very familiar with the pressures we've got with the high needs block of the Dedicated Schools Grant. We're currently out for consultation with schools around that provision. First briefing session is this evening. We will continue to have pressure with growth in this area, more education, health and care plans, more requirements of home to school transport. And you'll see in the budget proposals, the savings we were proposing, somewhat delayed, but more appropriately increased provision is meaning that savings in this area are very challenging. So I think we're making the best efforts we can to derive those savings, but we're going to have ongoing pressures as the population of Cambridgeshire increases, and we see relative need increase too.
Okay, thanks, John. Martin, is there anything specific you'd like to add from a financial point of view?
I mean, really just to reiterate what both Lou and John have said, really, and I think, as we know, in a normal year, business planning is a difficult enough process. In this year, with all of the unknowns that we've got at the moment about trying to predict what's happening with COVID, it's obviously even harder. Obviously, the basis that we've taken kind of corporately is to kind of work on, a series of scenarios in terms of looking at, the current situation and what would happen if the situation does change over the coming months, and that's kind of set out in the report. The kind of the scale of the impact that could potentially have, but as both Lou and John have alluded to, we are still in that kind of a bit of an unknown stage of what that impact on both children's social care and education is, and obviously it's going to be a moving picture with some significant challenges for the council as a whole as we move forward, and obviously we're going to be continuing to work on those those plans and scenarios as that information becomes more readily available over the coming weeks and months.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'll go to members in a second, but I just want to reiterate really what's been said by all the officers. Really, this is a unique time. I know there's many senior members here who've been through this process quite often, and I guess we've never seen it quite like this, and the uncertainties even more that we face now and in the coming months, really. So it is early days with this process. It's given us some certainly food for thought to think about, really. So yeah, so I just wanted to get that across, really. Lucy, would you like to come in?
Yes, thank you. And yes, I echo what you've just said, Simon, in that I have been through this process a number of times, and I have never been through it under circumstances like this. And I absolutely sympathise with the officers in trying to build any kind of a budget, going into a winter where we just have no idea really what the course of the winter is going to bring, in terms of extra costs or extra requirements for services, or even, and I think this is one of the key points that I want to make, what support is going to be made available from government. And I think we are very, very aware of the absolute uncertainty for the council over the services that are going to be needed. In the spring, when we were heading into lockdown, there was a very clear message from government that council's costs would be met. And my concern at this point is that we are not getting that message from government, and that there are kind of really serious worries about how any additional costs are going to be met and what the settlement from government is going to be this time. I think that we're expecting a statement in November on local government financing and the general approach. I very much hope that will be towards the beginning of November rather than at the very end of November, because actually all through that time we're going to have to be making decisions about how we're going to cope with the additional costs that there are, and looking at the figures here, you can see quite quickly what a number of those additional costs are, and they will mount up. And we already know also what the impact on the council's finances of loss of income has been already and is likely to continue to be. So I have huge sympathy with the officers who are trying to make these decisions. I do wonder whether as a committee, we want to ask Simon to write in and say how important it will be to make sure that we do have that backup funding coming from government in future, and also about the urgency for it, because particularly on things like making sure that we have got provision available for additional costs, it is important to know that there is that backup if we need it, which we did have in the spring and which is kind of notably absent at this point. The final, much more specific point I wanted, or it's a question to Lou really, is about, I know we were expecting a rise in numbers of children in need, and when there hadn't been children in need cases and children needing to come into care picked up during the course of the spring. And it is actually very good news that there hasn't been that bulge, that we don't seem to have found that kind of huge unmet need out there. I'm quite relieved that that has not been the case. One thing that I am concerned about, and it's something that's come up in a couple of sort of anecdotal cases for me personally recently, are cases of domestic violence where families have been kind of stuck together and stuck it out, but actually as we go into the winter the pressure is rising. And I've heard of a couple of cases recently where there is domestic violence going on in the household, but the women and children don't feel that they have anywhere else to go. So my question really for Lou is, what's the situation with women's refuges? Are there places, I mean, do we have enough places and enough spaces to make people safe if that is necessary?
So just in terms of, can I start with the point about demand actually, because what I would say before I start personally lighting any candles on cakes and celebrating is that we're still a little bit early in the academic year to be confident that we haven't seen a increase. So next time we meet, I'll feel like I'm possibly on slightly more solid ground. But you know, we always see a peak in referrals after the summer holidays. There is nothing that's saying that this is, you know, significantly out of kilter than in previous years. But it's still got, that period of time that we see that peak in referrals sort of ends around the October half-term period. So I'm not quite celebrating just yet in relation to that. In terms of domestic abuse, I mean, you know, we will always act to safeguard children. There is a national issue around refuge places, and there has been for a considerable period of time, actually. But we do, you know, if there are women and children at significant risk, we will respond. Now, that might be, you know, if we have other ways of doing so if we cannot secure a refuge place. So I would encourage people not to, you know, and I would encourage you to be saying to people who might be contacting you that actually, yes, they do need to ask for help and support and they will get it.
Thank you, that's reassuring, that's really helpful.
Lucy, I'll just come in here because I know you suggested about writing a letter. My thoughts on that would probably be, as the chair, would be, is it the right time now? Do we do that further down the line a little bit when the picture becomes slightly clearer? Because I do worry that, you know, it may be a little bit premature right now when we don't know what the whole landscape is really. Okay, so just food for thought. Let's move on for Councillor Joan Whitehead. Just before you come in, Joan, just for members of the public watching this meeting, Councillor Whitehead's video is not switched on because I think she was having some IT issues, and it's just enabled her to stay in the meeting, but not with the video. So just to make that clear. So over to you, Joan.
Thank you. I'm going to say things that I probably have said almost every year about savings. I mean, I have, would support the proposals in paragraph 5.4 for areas we're going to try to make savings, but they are the same areas that we have been trying to make savings, I think, every year for as long as we've been trying to make savings. They are the same areas, they come up all the time. They are immensely difficult to make savings in. I would say they are probably fairly near impossible. After all, as I understand it from the finance report we had circulated, that the deficit on this year already, for this financial year, is 2.1 million. I think that's correct. Including COVID, it was 13.7, but the deficit, excluding COVID related expenditure, was 2.1 million. So already we have got an issue of a deficit on this year's budget, which we will either have to do something about or carry forward. And the areas which produce that deficit are all the areas which we are about to try to make savings. And I would regard, I would support our attempt to do this, as I always have, but I do feel they're aspirational as opposed to actually being realistic. As I say, no objection to us trying to go forward, but certainly making savings has been extremely difficult. We have made some progress in a number of areas, more children being adopted and fewer children coming into care. But I am not absolutely convinced that we're going to make massive savings for the new budget, and I don't know what we're going to do about the 2.1 million deficit on the current budget. So I am pessimistic as usual about the ability of CYP to make significant savings, particularly under increasingly difficult circumstances. So okay, I felt I had to say that again.
Okay, thanks, Joan. Points well made, but I guess just as chair, I think, if we look back at our children in care numbers and the journey that we've had with our children in care numbers, reducing them over the last 12 months, then stuff is achievable. I have every faith in the officers that, they are challenges. You're absolutely right. They are significant challenges, but, we have to rise up to those challenges and collectively face them. So I think that we'll face it and we'll tackle it. But Lou, did you want to come in?
Yes, I was going to make a similar point in terms of children in care numbers. We're we're actually closer to our statistical neighbour average most recently in terms of children in care numbers, but we won't see the full year impact in terms of savings on placement costs for that until next financial year. So I'm reasonably optimistic about that. Obviously, the unknown being if there is any surge in demand as a result of COVID. There has been some good news in terms of Home Office funding for unaccompanied asylum-seeking young people, and particularly young people who've left care. So finally, the Home Office has acknowledged that it has been underfunding local authorities in that area for some time. For Cambridgeshire, that does mean that we should be able to make a small, not massive savings, but a contribution towards savings next year, because we have applied an amount of base budget to support those young people. We shouldn't need to do so moving forward. So there are some, I know, Joan, it is very difficult, and particularly difficult at the moment because we don't know exactly what's going to come down the line. But I think there are some signs of progress in some areas.
Okay, thank you, Lou. Councillor Peter Downs.
Yes, thank you.
Could I come back a point, Simon, please? May I?
Yeah, okay. So Peter, just hang on a second. Joan, come back then, please.
Yeah, I mean, I take your point, Luke, but I do notice in the figures that the number of children coming into care has risen slightly, and I think you're saying that may well happen. That may be, unfortunately, something that we're going to have to face. And this is where I think the difficulty comes in trying to reduce children in care. Yes, I think we've made great strides, but at the end of the day, if a child needs to come into care, they have to come into care. And that is where I think trying to achieve savings in that area is just so difficult. Yes, as I said, we have made progress, and certainly we've made progress on, for example, children and adoption. But I still feel it's an uphill struggle.
Okay, thanks, Joan. Councillor Lou, did you want to come back? I see your hand. Is that a historic hand or?
No, that's just to say yes. In the August figures showed a slight increase, Joan, but actually the September figures have reverted back onto a downward trend. And the reason why I'm sitting here feeling reasonably confident about this, COVID aside, is because of the family safeguarding approach that we've got in Cambridgeshire, which is associated with lower numbers of children in care. But you're absolutely right. And just to be, and this is what I just wanted to say really, you know, if children need to come into care because they're at risk of harm, they will continue to do so. I just want to be really clear about that.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Downs, thanks for being patient. Over to you.
First of all, I just wanted to echo what Lucy said about, we recognise that this is, every year is difficult, but this is probably the most difficult of all the years I can remember, which are many. We recognise there have to be probably some savings. I just want to make one particular point, which is worrying one of my colleagues in my group, and that is home to school transport savings. And she particularly asked me to urge you to be very, very careful in making home to school transport reductions where there is any risk whatever of endangering pupils who have been used to having buses and have to walk. She wanted me to make that point. Obviously, again, it is a specific case in mind, which I can alert Jonathan to outside the meeting. But the general principle is that we must put pupil safety first and foremost, even if we don't meet our budget.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Jonathan, would you like to come back on that? I mean, it's obvious to me that, you know, safety is paramount to all our children in the county. So do you want to come in on that?
Can I suggest that Hazel probably talks about this, because there is a process by which we review routes, so it's probably useful to share that with you, Peter. And
absolutely. Sorry, Hazel. Please come in then, please.
No, that's fine. Yeah, more than happy to respond. And again, just to assure Councillor Downs and his constituent who's raised this, absolutely, safety is a prime consideration. And as a starting point, before we would consider making any changes to an existing route where transport is provided, is to do a detailed risk assessment. And we involve specialists from the road safety team in doing that. They do things like they assess the volume and speed of traffic. And it's only as a result of their recommendations where they judge a route meets the council's policy criteria to be deemed to be suitable for a child to walk along, and it is accompanied by an adult. I would stress that is very clear in the policy. It's not an expectation that children will walk routes on their own. We would then put a proposal through to a member service appeals panel, and it would be the member panel that would make the final decision on that. So that's the process that we would apply in all cases. But at the moment, we have got no proposals pending to review any routes across the county.
Thank you, that's reassuring.
Thank you, Peter. If you could just take your hand down. I can't see any other hands raised now, so we'll go to the report's recommendations, and it's to note the context provided for the 21 to 22 to 25 to 26 business plan, and comment on the draft proposals for the CY committee set out in section 5.4 and endorse their development. If anybody's got any objections to those recommendations, if you could raise your hand. Okay, so we've got Lucy. Anybody else?
Sorry, can I just say, Simon, it's not actually an objection, but can I just make a comment on them very quickly?
You can, yeah.
Just to say that I don't think we need to have a vote on this, because it is to comment on them. What I don't want to happen, as has occasionally happened in the past, is to have it thrown back at us that we've supported these proposals in committee. So we've commented on them, we haven't supported them. And can I just make that very clear?
Yeah, and I think, Lucy, that says that quite clearly in the recommendation. Is to note the overview and context of the report and comment on the draft proposals, which is what we've done. No one's going to hold you to say that you absolutely endorse everything in it. This is just purely, it is a draft report. You know, we will see it again. Yep. We'll certainly have further discussions on it as a committee going forward, and then ultimately GPC and full council. So there'll certainly be more discussion over it. So In that case, then I'll move on that we've noted and commented. We'll move on to agenda item 8, the Corporate Parenting Subcommittee Annual Report of 1920. Nicola, welcome, the Assistant Director of Children's Safeguarding. Could you introduce the report, please?
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you, Councillor Bywater. I'm conscious that we've got both the Chair and Councillor Costello, so Councillor Every and Costello here, whose report it is really, but I'll do my best to introduce it on their behalf. So it's quite difficult because this is actually obviously the annual report that ended in March this year. So really misses almost all of the discussion we've just been having around COVID and where things have got up to. So it might feel a little bit historic for members, but essentially this is a report looking at the activity of the Corporate Parenting Subcommittee in the previous year, and really hopefully makes sense to people, reflects against the 5 objectives that we have as the central focus for children and young people. So that's being and feeling safe, being healthy and leading a healthy lifestyle, achieving stability and permanence, preparation for adulthood, and hearing the voices of children and young people. So that the report is sort of split into those sections, with obviously a bit at the beginning, which hopefully was informative around just some of our numbers and demographics around the young people that we're caring for at the moment. It was also quite a busy year. So it's having to look back a bit, but we had a peer review from colleagues in Central Bedfordshire in October 2019, reflecting on and looking at how we were working with children in care and a bit around how the committee was operating. But then we also had a proper ILACS focus visit in the February this year, which focused in on children care particularly and gave us some quite helpful feedback, particularly I think for the committee, that things had moved forward significantly. It was really positive actually from the previous visit by Ofsted, but there was still a bit of work to do in terms of our participation activity, and hopefully what you can see from the report is actually a very significant investment and change in that participation, and we've come right up to date now. We've done an awful lot of work since March, but obviously some of that's not reflected in the report at the minute. I think it's in terms of have we achieved our goals or not for children in care. I think it's a bit of a mixed picture. So I think there has been some very positive improvements, particularly in things like foster care recruitment. That improved very significantly. We did a lot of work around health assessments in conjunction with our health colleagues. That's been a big issue for the committee over time. And the stability of our children in care is actually very strong in Cambridgeshire. There was also, and I'm hoping Jonathan will help me out a bit with this, a huge piece of work from the virtual school over the last year. So that has changed very significantly, and a very different focus and expectation of schools in Cambridge and obviously beyond, wherever our children are placed, and a different focus around how we work with our personal educational plans that children have and pupil premium money. And we are starting to see, it's a little bit of a slow burn, but we're certainly starting to see some real improvements there for our children and young people. There is work still to do on NEET. I think that came up at the last committee. So this is obviously a historic report, but we're well aware that the NEET wasn't quite where we would like. So sorry, children not in education and employment and training. You know, it's not quite where we want to be, but we already have a new task and finish group operating under the strategic leadership of Adrian Chapman, because NEET goes across several different areas of people and communities. So hopefully that's already moving forward. I think the other bit, just to finish, where I think we were really pleased, or the committee was really pleased, is the planning work around our care leavers had improved very significantly, and the care leaver offer, a lot of work went into that, particularly from our specialist personal advisor post, and very enthusiastic individual working on that. And that has continued to grow apace, I think, even since March. And there's a lot of work underway at the minute around apprenticeships, for example, with our care leavers. So I think it generally shows a lot of movement and change, and we're building to a bit of a new model that we're working with the subcommittee around now, but that changed sort of in August time. So it's not really reflected in the report. But I do think we've seen very significant movements forward, particularly with participation for children and young people. So I don't know if that covers everything. Perhaps I should ask Councillor Every whether she feels that covers everything. And then obviously I'm happy to take any questions.
Well, that's a good point to finish on, Nicola. I'll before we go on to debate it as members, I'd like to ask Councillor Every, in her capacity as chairwoman of the Corporate Parenting Subcommittee, if she would like to add anything further. I'm sure she would.
Thank you, Chair. I would like the opportunity to do that. I think, first of all, I would like to say that we have been on a journey over the last 4 years, and we have seen quite a few changes. But what I wanted to really mention was the collaboration that there is between all the elected members on that committee, the service leads and all the staff working together to support our children in care and our care leavers. It is the children are absolutely at the heart of everything we do, and in order to support that, I would like to say that a huge thank you to Nicola, who sort of picked this up just recently and has changed some of our thinking as well, which has been good and refreshing. And so just to let you know that we're going to change the way we work in future. We're no longer going to have 6 meetings a year where it's just us. We're going to have 3 meetings where it's us, and 3 meetings where it is the voice of the young people telling us what they want us to talk about. And I think that's a huge sea change. We tried to do it in different ways, but that didn't work, wasn't successful. And so what we've done is we've picked up, I have to say, the Peterborough model, which seems to be very successful. It hasn't started yet, and of course COVID hit, so we will see how we're going to manage that. But we're looking for that, and we're being trained. The members are being trained next week on how to work with youngsters on a panel who are going to tell us exactly what they want us to know. So that's really, really, really positive. But I would also like to say that this is not our report. This report belongs to every single councillor and member of staff that we have, because you are all corporate parents. So this is just not a piece of paper, which I hope you're going to read, but it's a piece of paper that I hope you're going to keep reading, because this is about the children for whom you are responsible. And something we're going to be working towards in future is to engage all of you more in that role, and to ask more of you to help us actively with that support. Just to give you one example, the care leavers have now got a pilot running where we have got 10 youngsters. They're based in Cambridge, but they all have a business mentor. And one of them is our esteemed chair, who's been mentoring a youngster who's leaving care. Now, this is something that I'm sure other councillors or even members of staff could get involved with in supporting the employability support that these youngsters need. So instead of asking you to help, we're going to be more specific in what we want you to do. Perhaps send out a list so that you could volunteer. And I think the youngsters themselves would welcome the opportunity to know how seriously you take this report about their lives and their progress. But overall, I just want to say huge thank you to the staff for what they've been doing over this particular time, and particularly with COVID, and the reports have been amazing. So thank you very much indeed, Wendy, Lou and Nicola and the service leads, etc. Thank you very much. And I'm sure the rest of you will be able to identify areas that you would like to drill down on, and we've got some experts here who can actually answer those questions. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Every and Nicola, for the presentation. We've got Councillor Downs, please.
Thank you very much. I would like particularly to ask for clarification about page 72 and the table at the bottom about the age and gender breakdown of the children in care. What is very striking from those figures is the disproportionate number of male unaccompanied asylum seekers. And I just wonder if the officers have got any comment to make on that. Is it that there are more boys seeking asylum than girls, or is it that they are just a greater risk? One reason why I ask is that one of my sons does this sort of work in Belgium, and he has noticed the same trend, that most of the asylum seekers coming into Belgium are in fact boys, and a lot of them need a lot of extra help. So I just wonder if the officers have got any comment on that and on that gender imbalance.
So perhaps I can answer that, Councillor Downs. I think the reality is that we just see more males, more boys making the journeys, really. So we have a legal responsibility to accommodate any unaccompanied asylum seeker that we assess to be under 18, really, regardless of risk, if you like. It's more about the parenting responsibility. So we don't differentiate based on gender or level of risk. It is just who is coming through and actually making it to the UK. Interestingly, there had been a very significant reduction in what we call spontaneous arrivals into Cambridgeshire because of COVID. However, they are starting to reappear again. So we did accommodate 3 young people just the other day who arrived spontaneously in Cambridgeshire. Most young people have been coming across the Channel into Kent. So that has been where most have been coming to, but they generally are young men. Young women don't travel as frequently. So that's what it's about.
Yes, thank you very much. I think that confirms what I suspected, that when families send their children away, which is a desperate thing for them to do, they would sooner, obviously a girl is at more personal risk perhaps, but also I think they believe that the boys, when they become young men, are more likely to be able to find work and earn enough money to support their families way back in the countries that they've come from. That is the kind of pattern that my son was talking about in Brussels. But it was very striking. It's not that they are intrinsically more difficult because they're boys.
No.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Councillor Whitehead. Councillor Whitehead.
I think you're on mute, Councillor.
Unmute me. Am I unmuted?
You are now. Carry on, John.
Oh, right. Sorry. Yes, it's just a bit of follow-up way on what Peter was saying, and also related to something in the report on page 78, which looks at children at risk of exploitation. I mean, given the number of children we have in care, it is a very small number of children indeed. But I was struck by the, particularly for older teenagers, the gender difference, where females are more likely to be open to sexual exploitation, males criminal exploitation. And I'd like to link that a little bit outside that, and also fits in with what Peter is saying, because it would be interesting to know if that pattern, that very strong gender divide, exists in the young population as a whole that may come to our attention, things like county lines and that kind of thing. But if we go back to asylum seekers, I mean, it may well be that there are young women coming into this country and brought into this country, but they are brought in specifically by traffic smugglers for the purposes of sexual exploitation. In other words, they are not traveling like some male potential asylum seekers, if you like, of their own volition, that they may be brought in by other sources. And obviously that is a well-known issue and a very underworld, underground issue. But I really just would be interested to have perhaps a bit of an update on where we were generally on looking at things like male criminal activity in young young men, both those in care and those out of it, and issues about female sexual exploitation, both those in care and out of it. As I say, I do want to stress that the numbers in care in these groups are very small, given the number of children we have in care. But I just would be interested in a bit more information on that. Thank you.
So I think that our children care population reflects really what we see in the wider population, which is stereotypically, it is still a bit that young women are more likely to face issues around sexual exploitation, and young men tend to be more likely to face risks around criminal exploitation. There are examples, we do have some examples where both things are happening for young people, and those are obviously very challenging situations. The numbers, what I would stress is the numbers overall are actually very small. So although it feels like it is a growing phenomenon perhaps, and we have had some individual examples of very concerning activity, it is still a very small number of children both in and out of care, and we need to sort of maintain that perspective. We do have an issue with county lines in Cambridgeshire, as I'm sure all members of this committee are aware, but we also have very strong relationships with the police and with community safety partners, and we have mechanisms to try and manage and address that in the wider population. And we meet very regularly with police colleagues around trying to manage that activity. So it is reflective in terms of children in care and the wider community, but it is very small numbers still.
Sorry, is that true of sexual exploitation as well?
Yes, yes. When it happens, it's very concerning, and there is obviously, these are things that do happen to some young people. I think, there was a period obviously where we didn't even have the terminology for these things. So they clearly do happen for young people, and they are very worrying when we come across them. But it isn't a massive phenomenon that impacts on lots and lots and lots of young people in the way that, concerns about neglect, for example, or child poverty, or, a whole range of other things that we work with. We are talking about really quite a small subsection of teenagers. But yes, it is obviously a concern when we find it, and we work very closely. The police would work with us around sexual exploitation just as much as they would around criminal and missing. So we try and see those three things together and work with police and other colleagues around those areas.
Thank you.
Thanks. And I guess that just to come in there, Nicola, the return home interviews are just as crucial. The Net Hub and all those sort of things are so crucial to helping to identify these issues as well, aren't they?
Yes. So we have a whole series of ways that we work and try and identify children, young people who might be at risk of these things. So we will always get missing notifications. So young people, if they go missing from home and they're notified to the police by their parents, for example, those all come into the local authority. We will then review those and consider them and work out which ones we need to turn into proper referrals, if you like, that would come into social care. But we also have a mechanism, Councillor Bywater's talking about a return home interview, where every child, usually teenager, will be offered an independent visit and discussion, sometimes virtually at the minute, obviously, to talk about where they went and what happened. And that's how we tend to pick up the differences between young people who are just going to a slightly dodgy party that maybe their parents didn't want them to go to, and those who are actually becoming involved in much more worrying activity. And we're usually able to nip that in the bud, to be honest, quite quickly. It is a very small cohort where we continue to have real concerns.
Okay, thank you, Nicola. Okay, so we've got Councillor Netzinger next, please.
Thank you. This wasn't what I was going to originally. I've got a separate question, but just picking up on what Peter and Joan were talking about the young asylum seekers. I think it is important to be aware that actually the risks to girls of that incredibly difficult, challenging journey across Europe to get here are even higher than the risks to boys, even though that journey is very difficult for anyone trying to make it. There's also the sense that actually if you're in a war zone, the risk to boys might be higher than to girls, and that might be one reason why more of them leave, because they are at risk of being, if they stayed at home, but getting drafted into armies, into even more dangerous activities. So I think that it's important to remember why people leave as well as look at who arrives. So related to that is a question that I have. I don't know whether you can answer this, Nicola. Do we know how many of the young asylum seekers who arrive here have arrived here because they're trying to join family members in this country? And then I've got another question.
So no, I don't have those numbers off the top of my head. They are sometimes what we find, sometimes with some of our young people who go missing quite quickly from care, is that they're either, there are issues around trafficking, or actually they are going to join family members, and they knew that, you know, that's one of the reasons why they've made the effort to come to the UK. We get separate requests from other countries. So I have, for example, a set of siblings coming from Somalia, actually, who have come through formally through the Home Office and are being reunited with family here. So we have different mechanisms and different ways that children and young people come in. The vast majority of our unaccompanied asylum seekers don't appear to have family in the area. We do spend time trying to link people up and do work with the Red Cross, trying to make connections back where people have come from. But you're absolutely right. There's a multitude of reasons why young people leave their country of origin, and potentially are looking for a range of different things when they get here. So it's about trying to work with them and help them and support them. And some of them are extremely emotionally and physically traumatized. And we try and do pieces of work to support them around that. It can be a horrendous experience for both boys and girls. Yeah. So, you know, unfortunately, you're not protected, whichever sex you are. It is very difficult and challenging for those young people.
Thank you. That's really helpful, and leads into my question. So I'm going to wrap the two I originally asked about it together. The first one is that it mentions in your report that there are issues about mental health support. So on page 18 of your report, or 82 of the whole document pack, it talks about recognising that mental health and emotional wellbeing services are fragmented, and that's being restructured. I just wondered if it would be worth that coming as a specific item to this committee, because I think that's a really important thing for us to be aware of, and it's obviously something that Ofsted were aware of. So just wondering whether it would be worth us having a longer update on that at some point. And the other thing I wanted to say is how very good it is to hear about the work which is being done with care leavers and apprenticeships. And I did slightly wonder whether it would be worth us having a longer update on that at some point, and also looking at whether the work that's been done so successfully with care leavers could potentially be expanded to some of our NEET young people.
Okay, so if I take those in two bits, I think the first comment about the fragmented mental health services, if I can just say, that is a direct quote from Ofsted. So I'm not sure that we would quite frame it like that. I think what we have been aware of over some time is that the services that our children in care need from mental health or around their emotional well-being are increasingly complicated. And the existing setup hadn't necessarily addressed all of the needs of those children, young people. So there is work going on in the wider mental health community, if you like, and health around some redesign and thinking about that. But for children in care, we have specifically looked at our corporate parenting offer, if you like, and Lou has been leading, but with the other assistant director, Alison Bennett, have actually been leading, looking at what our clinical offer is going to be going forward for children and young people in care. And actually we're just in the middle of finishing consultations and discussions with CPFT around how that's going to look. And we have actually planned to expand the offer because of the complex needs of children and young people. So I'm sure, I'm sort of looking at Lou through the Zoom, and he's going to nod at me. I'm sure we can bring, once we've finalised that, I think the problem is we're slightly in the middle still, but once that's finished, I'm sure we'll be very happy to bring a report back. It should obviously come to Corporate Parenting Subcommittee as well, but I'm sure we'll be very happy to bring that back to here and discuss a bit more about how we're trying to meet the emotional health needs of children and young people, because they often don't need the acute CAMS services, but it's the bit in the middle that we're trying to just flesh out better, basically, for those children.
Lou, would you like to come in here? Because I see you've raised your hand.
Yeah, I mean, Nicholas said it really, but just so we are looking, as Nicholas says, about the clinical offer around support for children, young people in care and care leavers. What I would suggest is that I incorporate it in a future service director report, because we are in the middle of that, and then we keep the number of separate reports down, and that it's appropriate, of course, for it to also go to corporate parenting, perhaps in a bit more detail, but to give the highlight and summary report in a service director report as we get that through.
That sounds fine. Thank you.
I think also, just given I'm involved in the mentoring scheme, I think that the plan is to let that sort of revolve at the moment. It's a bit too early to report on that. We just need to see how that pans out, and then the plan is to report on that, really. So because I do think it's very useful, and we certainly need to look at it. Okay, so Andrew, I think your hand flashed up and then flashed down and is back up.
Hang on,
Would you
Simon,
like
there was another. I had a different question about.
Okay, right. Okay, Lucy, come in. Then we'll go to Andrew. So, go on, Lucy.
So there was a question to Nicola, and or probably to Nicola, but to somebody about the work on apprenticeships and whether that might potentially be expanded for other children and young people not in employment.
So I think we're talking about two slightly different things, and I think Councillor Bywater was sort of alluding to some of it. So I think our children who are not in education, employment and training, we would look specifically at the vulnerable groups who are involved in that, who in this context are children in care. So we are already doing a piece of work around that, some of which is around the apprenticeship scheme and how we can manage that. And I think we've got updates programmed in, and again would probably come in Lou's report. I think more generally, I think the wider NEAT activity, there's a whole strategy around that, which is what I alluded to a bit earlier, that Adrian's leading. But I think for this committee, we can probably weave it together and bring it forward in probably Lou's next update, I think, to show you where we've got to, and perhaps just set out clearly what the plan is around that.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Nicola. Andrew, over to you, please.
Thanks, Chair, and thank you for a really comprehensive report. Nicola, you pay tribute to the virtual school and the impact that's had, and obviously I speak from the point of view of the Chair of the Virtual School Management Board, but I think we've made some gains as a consequence of the investment that's been made, and I'm very grateful to John Lewis in terms of expanding that team, having a new head teacher in post and appointing to some new posts. We still, though, of course, do have a life-changing attainment gap, which, although is favourable in the context of our statistical neighbours, of course, it mirrors the national gap. And I just felt it would be worth mentioning that in the context of will we as we move forward with the fiscal pressures we face, going to be in a position of sustaining that investment to continue our improvements in closing that gap.
So I think, John, are you going to say about the investment?
Yeah, I think at the current time, Andrew, I think we all agree with the gains that have been made. The attainment gap is huge. So for us to take our foot off the pedal here and say we're going to reduce our expenditure wouldn't be a positive thing, and that's why it's not part of the budget proposals we put forward. So I'm certainly going to be arguing that we continue to invest in this service. And actually the government has recognised this through the additional funding it's put into the People Premium Grant. So it's an area very much we think we can have big impact, and we will continue to protect that service as much as we can.
And I think just to but Andrew, I'm sure you know already, but to reassure everybody else, Claire, who is the head of virtual school, very much has a kind of a 3-year plan where we're at the beginning. We've done a lot of work in the last year, but she's absolutely looking at, this is what we're going to do next year, then we're going to do the year after. And we absolutely need to do some, we have to do something very radical about children in care's education. We're very committed to that as a service, and I know the corporate parenting subcommittee are as well. So we will continue to really push that. It needs to change, and it will. I think we're very much moving in the right direction now.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Downs.
Yes, thank you again. I wanted to just pick up a point that Liz Every made at the beginning, which is very important, and that is that all councillors are corporate parents, not just those on the parents subcommittee or even on the CYP committee. Therefore, I wanted to ask whether this report is made available, in fact sent to all councillors. Does that actually happen? And if it doesn't, could it?
Well, I see some people nodding here, but we'll certainly take that, and we'll certainly ensure that that's sent around, Peter. Definitely, it certainly needs to be shared with our colleagues.
Yeah.
Okay, Councillor Hoy.
I was just nodding with Peter because he is right. It does apply to every councillor, so I think it might be useful just circulating by email, because I think the report's quite self-explanatory. And obviously, if anyone's got questions, I'm sure they can direct those to officers after. But I think it'd be quite a useful report for everyone to see.
Yeah. Okay. So, Rishendra, if you can take that as an action, please, from this. Thank you very much. Okay. So,
could you please extract it from the page meeting? Otherwise, it take people too long to find it.
Yeah, we'll make sure it's an individual report.
A discrete item, I think. Yes.
Yeah. Understood.
From this committee.
Understood. Yeah, we'll ensure that's done. Okay, I've got historic hands there for you, Peter. So there's nobody else indicating they want to speak. The recommendation is to note the contents of the report, which we have done. But as chairman, I just really want to summarise everything. Really, that particularly my thanks go to Councillor Every and all the members of the corporate parenting subcommittee and officers. They've done extremely well in challenging circumstances over the last 6 months. And I know that I've been to some of the participation events, and I want to ensure that the message gets back to our participation service, because it is a crucial part that they play in this. And also, more importantly, the message of thanks from this committee must go to the young people who engage in this process as well. I think they've been absolutely instrumental. Going bowling and trampolining seems a lifetime ago now, but it's all part of the process and the engagement to hear from our young people. And one of the things that was always relevant to me, that resonated with me with these young people when I saw them, was about stability. And I think we're cracking it. I think we are cracking it. It's not the finished article, as we've seen in the report. There are areas of development, and we must push on really, and link into what Peter and Liz and Sam have all said, that the corporate parenting message is for us all to support this really going forward. So I'll shut up and we'll move on. Okay, so thank you very much. Okay, so we'll now move to agenda item number 9, which is the Service Director's report from Lou Williams, the Children Safeguarding Officer. Lou, do you want to jump back in now, please, and present your report?
Yes, so very briefly, this report looks at some of the steps that we took during the pandemic and lockdown period, and shows some indication of the impact that has had in terms of some areas of performance reporting. So, we did, for example, see a reduction in the number of referrals in the immediate period of lockdown. Reassuringly, actually, and just picking up on earlier comments, they have come back up again to more or less where we might expect them to be, which does indicate that despite our concerns about children being less visible, we were still getting referrals of children, albeit there was a delay initially. There has similarly, in terms of early help, so looking at just below paragraph 2.15, there was a significant drop off in terms of early help, but that's picked up very quickly actually in June and July. We would usually see a reduction in August because services are generally not there during that period of time. So there are some positive indications that actually, you know, despite the lockdown, we were seeing children, young people being presented, accessing the support that they needed. And we saw some real benefits from some types of interventions with families in terms of virtual engagement. So I think I've said before that, you know, attendance at kind of virtual drop-ins for parents, virtual parenting programs has worked well, and it's something that we'd want to continue. But I think it's also clear that, and it's become increasingly clear really over the time, that whilst there are some strengths in some approaches to virtual meetings, when you're talking about the more challenging and more complex end of the business, so thinking about children who are subject to child in need plans or subject to child protection plans, where parents have got complex issues around domestic abuse, substance misuse, alcohol misuse, mental health, that virtual work, virtual groups manage to kind of maintain things, but they haven't as an effective model in terms of moving things forward. And I think that that does explain some of the increased levels of volume we've seen in the system. So if you look, for example, at the chart for child protection plans, we saw, we have been seeing a reduction in numbers of children on child protection plans. We've seen that just step up a little bit in the last 3 months or so of the summer. We think that's really more about it taking longer to move children through a child protection plan as opposed to more children coming onto a child protection plan. So, the bath analogy that I use, if you've got the taps on, the bath will overflow if the plug is blocked. And that has been what we've kind of seen in relation to child protection. We saw it a little bit in terms of children in care as well. And, there was a slight increase and certainly a reduction in the rate of decline, and then a slight increase in numbers of children in care in August 2020. As I said, actually just before, the most recent data in relation to children in care numbers, they've continued again now to reduce, and they're down to around 675 is the most recent number that I have, which is a full 100 less than it was the case in August 2019. We still want to get to a position where we have around 600 to 620 children in care during the next financial year. We're confident that we can do that, all things being equal, because of family safeguarding, because family safeguarding does deliver better outcomes for children living in the most complex circumstances, does help parents address the issues. But of course, the unknown quantity is in relation to COVID. And in terms of visiting children, we've seen that we, again, initially for children subject to child protection plans, Nicola was really clear right from the beginning that we needed to make sure that we did face-to-face visits to children subject to child protection plans and to higher risk children in need plans. That's different to a lot of authorities. A number of authorities did virtual visiting from the get-go. Nicola rightly was very clear that we needed to have face-to-face visiting. And you can see that, that was more difficult initially, and some of that was about family reluctance. But actually we're up above 90% of visits on time for children on child protection plans. We've used some flexibilities around children in care visiting, although those have largely come to an end now. The rules changed and we could do virtual visits, and we did so where children were in very settled placements and there were no indications that we had any concerns. And then finally, the report talks about, and I've rehearsed these points previously, where we think there might be an increase in demand moving forward. I've said, as you know, I'm quite concerned about that very small, but potentially high need group of young people who were already disengaged from education before schools largely closed. Obviously, they remained open for vulnerable pupils, but I think we'll see a small number of children and young people finding it very difficult to re-engage in education, and that could result in a small increase in the number of people that are very vulnerable. On the positive side, I meet with Pinpoint and other groups, and what they are saying is that they're not seeing lots of parents struggling to get children into school, which is really positive because they were worried about children, particularly children with disabilities or children on the autistic spectrum disorder really struggling to get into school. That doesn't seem to have been the case. So that's been important. And I think it's reflective actually of how well the schools have worked through the shutdown period, but also now as we're moving into you know, pupils returning, just to engage families and pupils altogether. As a service, in terms of children's social care, we have a vulnerable children's tracker that makes sure that we are, that where children are known to us and who are not in school, we are working with schools and with education colleagues to promote their re-engagement into school. I'll finish there. I'm sure there will be some questions and I'll do my best to answer them.
Okay, thank you very much, Lou, for a detailed report and summary. Members, any questions from members? I'm not seeing anybody. I think that speaks volume for the recognition of the work that you and the team are doing, Lou, so well done. Members, we have got the recommendations A to C in front of us, and given this is a public meeting, I just really think it's important to read out recommendation A. I mean, obviously B and C are to note it, but I think really just to, sorry, Lou, would you?
Yes, so I realised when I wrote recommendation A that I should have put in foster carers in that recommendation. So as you read it out, could you put in foster carers if the committee agrees, please?
Well, yes, I'm sure. I see lots of nodding, and I'm sure, yeah, because obviously it's a very good point. So just to read recommendation A, record their thanks to all frontline staff and managers in children's services, including foster carers, for their continuing dedication to safeguarding children in these challenging times. And a special thanks to all those who continued to visit children, young people and families during lockdown, because I think, you know, that's got to be recognised by us all that it's a significant challenge for everybody within the service. So members, I see a lot of nodding. I think you're all in agreement that we've noted and commented on this report. So we'll take that as a unanimous support. Thank you very much, Lou and team. So we'll move on. Okay, we're now on to agenda item 10, which is, just excuse me a moment, I just jumped to page. Okay, so the committee agenda plan, appointments and training plan, standard item here for everybody. Rashenda, would you just like to update us on any changes in the agenda plan?
There are no changes to the published agenda plan, Chair.
Okay, thank you very much. And there are also no changes to the committee training plan and appointments. So we'll take it noted unless anybody's got any questions. No. Okay, and then finally, we'll move on to the determined admissions arrangement, which is the additional report that I've allowed to come to committee. This report was added to the agenda after publication as an urgent item of business with my agreement and in accordance with the arrangements for the committees taking urgent decisions which are set out in the Constitution. Hazel Belchamber, the Assistant Director for Education, Capital Place Planning, would you introduce the report? But just before I call you in, members, I just want to point out that this was part of John Lewis's education report that came last month. This is really, well, Hazel will go into more detail about it, but this is really our process of crossing the T's and dotting the I's, really. So in that case, Hazel, would you like to come in and just present your report, please?
Yeah, and Councillor Bywater, I don't intend to say much by way of introduction, but I would like to start with an apology for the fact that it has proved necessary for us to ask for this report to be added to today's agenda for members' consideration and approval at such short notice. It's a result of, I have to say, an officer oversight. It's a report that we are required to produce annually as part of the school's admissions code requirements, and it should have been presented to members much earlier in the year. So apologies for that. We have been asked formally by the Office of the Schools Adjudicator to rectify this, and until we do so, we are deemed to be acting in breach of compliance with the admissions code. There was only one change proposed as part of the annual consultation arrangements, which are subject to determination, which was a reduction in the published admission number for Eastfield Infant School in St Ives. There were no objections to this. So as Simon, as you've said, it is a process matter really, that we just need the committee's approval to this and for this to be formally minuted. Thank you.
Okay, members, any comments on this particular report? You've all got the recommendations in front of you, so on that basis, can I take it as a unanimous decision that we're happy to agree this? Okay, lots of heads. I see nobody raising their hands, so in that case, we'll take that as carried. Okay, so that then formally leads me to announce that this is now the end of the meeting. The committee will next meet on Tuesday, the 11th of November, and the arrangements and notifications will come through in due course. I now declare this meeting closed. Thank you very much for your time, and I'll see you all very soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.